Well, good morning. Welcome back to the Higher Grounds podcast. This is your morning minute meditation for this morning. I want to call your attention to the book of Genesis and Genesis chapter number 13 this morning. And I want to read 4 verses to you in this chapter and I give you a thought this morning for this morning minute meditation. Genesis chapter 13, verse number 1. And Abram went up out of Egypt. You check the wording, up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. And there Abraham called upon the name of the Lord. In Genesis chapter 13, you'll find Abram is going back to the beginning, or at the first, where he built an altar with the Lord. You come through the book of Genesis, starting in chapter 11, you start reading about the life of Abram and his wife Sarai, and you start studying his life and his movements, where God called Abram out of the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, and he's fixing to be the head of the Hebrew race. And you start studying his life, and when you get to Genesis chapter 13, we're just barely into the life of Abram, and you'll find that he's going back. He's returning. And if you would, in Genesis chapter 13, they're coming out of Egypt, and Egypt's the type of the world. And so you see that Abram has been in the world, and he's not actually done all that God's called him to do or wanted Abram to do. And so in Genesis 13, he's repenting. He's returning back. At the first, you remember his tent and his altar. He built an altar and called upon the name of the Lord in between Bethel and Hai. Bethel being the house of God, Hai being a heap of ruins. And so I want you to think about Abram's life over the past few chapters on halting halfway between the house of God and a heap of ruins. And so if Abraham's getting right with God, and he's going back to the altar, the last place that he talked to God, he's retracing his steps. So I want to do that this morning here just for a moment. I want you to look at Abram's steps, what's got Abram up to this place. Genesis chapter 11, Abram is called out of the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. He is to go to Canaan land, a land that God has promised him. And but there's something happened in Abram's life at that time. He's disobedient to God. Now, he was partially disobedient, but partial disobedience is still total disobedience. God told Abraham to leave the land and his loved ones, but yet he brought Terah, his father, Lot, his nephew. And so we find that he was driven by his family and not his faith. We can't let our family dictate what the will of God is for our life and the direction and the path that God has paid for us. Number 2, Genesis chapter 12, verse 6 through 9, we'll find that Abram is drifting. He's going to the south, even to the south. And so we find he's not only driven by his family, but he's driven by his flesh. His flesh is a driven factor in his life, and your flesh is the same way as your family. It cannot dictate the path that God has for your life. Genesis chapter number 12, verse number 10, you'll find that he's driven by a famine. There's a famine in the land. He's in Canaan land. He's built an altar. There's a famine that rises in his life. And so we find that in Genesis chapter number 12, verse number 10, there's a famine. And so he detours from his life. We can't let the famines that's in our seasons be able to dictate us the path and the plan that God has for us. And finally, Genesis chapter number 11, verse number 13, the famine drives him to the land of Egypt. When they're getting ready to go into the land of Egypt, in Genesis chapter 11, verse 13, they come up with a lie. Why? Because he's driven by fear. Fear is a driving factor in Abram's life. He said, Sarah, we got to tell Pharaoh that you're my sister, not my wife, because they'll kill me to take you as their wife. And so he lied. There's the deception in Abram's life. And, of course, his son did the same thing. And so he's starting a pattern here in his life and his family's life. And so they're down in Egypt. And so they're driven by their family. They're driven by their flesh. They're driven by the famine. And they're driven by fear. But can I say it's the failures in Abraham's life that's driven him back to his faith in Genesis chapter number 13. And so I want you to think on Abram's life this morning, halting halfway between the house of God and a heap of ruins.